Hello everyone, welcome to this version of Field Friday. My name is Terry Aukus. I'm an agronomy sales manager for the western half of CFE, and today I'd like to give an update about cover crops and share a few slides with you and some information. So as everyone can attest, this spring was extremely difficult with the amount of moisture that we received, and even as you look back at the weather patterns seem like they continue to change, and so I wanted to share some information that I pulled. The first slide that I wanted to share with you is I pulled data from the EPA's website, and what this does done is looked at the last 100 years in regards to heavy rain events in the surface area in the United States on how many areas are receiving heavy rain event. And so basically what this slide is saying is in the last 20 years we've received more heavy rain events in the last 20 than we did in the previous 60 to 70 years. So not only are the heavy rain events increasing in the total amount of rainfall, but also the total surface area in the United States that's receiving the heavy rains. And a heavy rain event would be considered anything over 2.5 inches. And I can remember 20, 30 years ago, we used to receive a 2 to 3 inch rain, and that was a heavy rain. And now it seems like our weather patterns will have 4 to 6 inches of rain, which is an awful amount of rain in a short amount of time. And so you sit there and say, how do we protect our soils in that environment? And so with that, there's been a lot of interest in no-till or minimum till, strip till, cover crops, anything that a grower can do to try to minimize soil erosion and keep soil in place. So as we look at just normal what the heavy rainfalls do, it's extremely difficult to manage nitrogen, particularly nitrogen loss, whether it's denitrification or leaching within the soil profile. This next slide is a study that was done with Iowa State University, and what they did was the yellow bar represents no cover crop, the dark green bar represents a rye cover crop, and the light green bar represents an oat cover crop. And in a corn soybean rotation in Iowa, what they did was they measured the total amount of N coming from each cropping system in that environment. And based on the data, generally a cereal rye or an oat cover crop is reducing nitrate loss 20 to 40 pounds of N that's leaving through the tile system. You know, quite often we think that nitrogen is leaving just a corn field scenario, but technically we can have just as much N that leaves a soybean field too. And so protecting that N in both systems is quite important. As you look at, Iowa State has done a lot of work and research in regards to N loss and different management practices. And as you look at that, there's a whole variety of practices that can minimize N. For example, we have a lot of growers that are looking at side dressing or top dressing their N. And if you look from that management practice, we can reduce nitrate loss from 5 to 10%. Utilizing a nitropyrin like Instinct can be up to 10% nitrate loss reduced. And then focus on rye and oat crop, approximately 30%. And then of course, buffers are up to 90%. So what I find interesting and what a lot of folks are looking at is to do one management practice is one thing, but to start using 2, 3, 4 practices, split applied N with reduced tillage using a nitropyrin and cover crop, we can reduce as upwards of 30 to 50% nitrate loss from that field. Phosphorus is somewhat of the same concept, although phosphorus physically leaves the field via soil leaving the field with erosion. So again, cover crops are pretty consistent as it relates to nitrogen as well, with about a 20-30% reduction in soil erosion, which hence retains about that much phosphorus in the soil too. So as we look at critical N management practices, you know, we're very passionate about cover crops, but that's just one tool in the toolbox, and there are many that we look at N management decision as we manage to try to get maximum yield and reduce nitrogen loss. But it's rate reduction. In a lot of instances, we're over applying or applying more than we think we need to account for the loss. And so just trying to tie rate tied to our yield goal is critical. Side dress, again, moving half of our N or a portion of that N later in the season, so we're not putting all our N out up front with a heavy spring rain, because you're just exposed to losing that much N. Again, we talked about cover crops and the rooting and leaving those roots in place, absorbing nitrate from the soil when the growing season's done in where cover crop will help again reduce that nitrogen loss. Reduce tillage, that relates back to phosphorus loss and physical soil movement, again keeping phosphorus in place. And then lastly, using a nitrogen inhibitor like an Instinct or a nitropyrin N-Serve anhydrous in the fall is very critical. Again, we have any combination. In a lot of instances, the more of these practices we can do, the better we're going to be able to retain and keep phosphorus and nitrogen in our soil profile. And then lastly, a benefit, as I'm going to show a few different cover crops and some guidelines as we enter cover crop season here. One benefit that we see is the suppression of weeds. So not only do cover crops help break up compaction, help keep nutrients in place, provide ground cover, but they also suppress weeds. And so this study was done by the University of Missouri, and what they did was the red bar represents a check and it's weed pressure in a field, and they basically harvested the weeds from the weed mass from a square meter and compared different cover crops to some herbicide burn downs. And so quite common is a Roundup 2,4-D burn down, and this burn down was done in the fall. And you can tell by where the bar is that with the amount of weed plant material that was harvested, and just comparing that to an oats, for example, or a cereal rye, an adequate stand of cereal rye was actually a little bit better, or considerably better than a fall burn down of just Roundup and 2,4-D. So when we adequately seed enough seed on cereal rye or oats, we can get that allopathy or suppression of weed, which is kind of a neat benefit, and especially important as Palmer amaranth continues to move closer to northwest Iowa, southeast South Dakota, and southwest Minnesota, that we can continue to use the herbicides that we do and take the pressure off of our herbicides so they keep working best for us. So with that, those are some rundown of some of the reasons why we look at cover crops and the different management practices and the benefits of those. And so I'm going to share just a few pointers as we approach silage cutting season. So one of the first cover crops that are utilized for helping break up compaction, of course the heavy rains created some potholes in lowland areas that have drowned out, and so growers are looking, how do I break up the compaction? And so a real typical is kind of an interesting one, a neat one, is the tillage radish. And so we planted a plot by Elvord about middle of June, and this is about 2 months growth. And so typically they can get considerably larger in this if they have a certain amount of time. But what happens is when we seed that tillage radish, that tip will hit 290 psi, and once it does, it sends a burrower down in the soil profile, and that tillage radish will push out of the ground. And typically you'll see tillage radish where the soil line is approximately in the middle, and there'll be a green above and white below, and that's why it's called a tillage radish, is it's doing its work. It's breaking up that compaction. And they do search for excess nutrients in the soil profile too, so they're really good at recycling. In a livestock forage situation, I know growers they'll create a grazing mix of 4 or 5 6-way products, and they'll use that for cow-calf operation where they can graze it, or sheep for that matter. I've seen it where radishes can be grazed. They got a lot of above ground forage. Another one that's used in grazing systems and in just true row crop, cover crop, is turnip. Turnip's relatively inexpensive. You get a lot of seeds per pound, and again, it's a scavenger for nutrients and also help break up compaction, and very beneficial for wildlife and or in grazing situations. Once cows figure out that these are in a small grains or in a grazing situation, they root them up and they absolutely love them. They're a good source of protein. So we still have plenty of time to seed these 2 brassicas. Typically we want to get them in by the middle of the 3rd week of September for maximum benefit, because we still need some time this fall to get some growth out of them. Another grass that was planted this summer based on the amount of prevent plant is a product called teff grass. Very difficult to get a hold of, but some came available, and so very high palatability, very fine stemmed, easy to make hay because it's due to fine stem. Probably not the best to graze because it's got not the greatest root system, but that where livestock could pull it out of soil profile, but multiple cuttings in a season, warm season that thrives in the heat. And so there's been a lot of focus on teff grass. The guys are looking at that even down the road beyond this year as a grass source. Again, I put a plug in for cereal rye and oats. We're just starting to aerial apply those as we speak, and as silage comes off in the next couple weeks, growers will seed those products. Very common. And again, if you don't want the wintering product, we use oats, and where we want maximum benefit for the dollar, I'd suggest cereal rye in the fall, and it will break dormancy early in the spring and get tremendous amount of benefit from those. The last thing I wanted to touch on, based on prevent plant rules that were changed by RMA, a lot of sorghum went in. We sold more sorghum this spring than I can remember. And so one thing I wanted to focus on, a couple tidbits. There's a true forage sorghum that grows 8 to 9 feet tall. But interesting enough, there's what's called dwarf sorghums. And what they do is they condense that 8-foot plant down to a 5-foot plant. It's important for several reasons. Typically sorghum can be a little bit wetter in the fall. The shorter plant adds in standability. And what it does is the dwarf sorghum is an extra leafy gene in it, and it condenses the nodes. So if you'd look, the nodes are stacked a lot more so on the dwarf sorghum. And so you really don't give up a lot of tonnage in regards to that. One thing that I want to be word of caution on the sorghums, again, there's quite a bit that were planted, is prussic acid poisoning. Prussic acid poisoning is basically when we get our first freeze or hard frost that triggers basically cyanide production in that plant. And so what has to happen is we need to leave that plant in the field for 10 days after that hard freeze to allow that poison to basically flush itself out of the plant. And then even upon that, it is recommended that if you had not harvested it and you're concerned, ensile it, and the longer you can ensile it, that it'll actually, the levels will go down on the prussic acid. And then also we can test for it, so you can work with your nutritionist and what the proper amount in your ration can be without jeopardizing the health of the livestock. With that, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact myself or any other CFE co-op agronomist. And that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.